So I'm very excited to be here. Very simply, the energy we get through power lines, fuel cells, and batteries are essentially the lifeblood of our civilizations. This is a very high-stakes game we're playing. Now, I just wanted to throw in a few figures before my presentation for fun. We had some great figures about energy developments in the United States and Europe, and I thought pulling up a couple of notes from Japan might be interesting. When it comes to smart houses and things, we have quite a lot of activity in Japan. So virtually every house that's built now is a smart house with solar panels and feeds back to the grid. And the growth curves are very interesting here. I mean, we're looking at 30% year-on-year growth in terms of revenue from smart homes and 30% year-on-year growth in terms of actual deployments of homes. We're looking at a very nice projection in terms of the number of buildings that will be smart in the future. And the market penetration, I think it's a good sign. Market penetration will be about 30% by 2023. And I feel like Japan, which is my home, I'm a permanent resident, is doing relatively well on that aspect of future power. But we do have some serious headwinds when it comes to carbon neutrality. Most of our nuclear reactors are offline since 2011. And with the stringent new requirements, only 9 are producing power, though the majority of those 54 reactors are still functional. They're just idling. And we reopened our coal and oil energy generation, which is a huge blow to our carbon footprint. I guess my takeaway from all of this is, you win some, you lose some. And we all have a plenty big job to do on this. And I know that globally, this particular initiative from Linux Foundation will contribute hugely to optimizing energy in the future, and especially dealing with the fact that we just don't have enough energy today, but we cannot keep increasing our emissions. It's a heck of a balance, and technology will underline that. Now, I'm going to talk about the OpenChain project and how we make a small contribution to this. OpenChain is essentially about getting the licensing right around open source. I'll explain how that works and why that's important from a relatively high level and show you what we're doing in practical terms around the world. So when it comes to our technology nowadays, essentially software underpins all of it. We cannot really build any technology without software in these days. And open source underpins modern software. The penetration of open source in companies is 100%. And that number is not a Linux Foundation number. That's the number I get from audit companies. Companies like Synoptics, companies like Flexera. They never look at a company's code without finding open source. So no matter where you go, you'll be using software, and no matter what you do, you'll be using open source. It's the fabric of computing in this modern age. Now, open source is interesting because we have a situation where we have shared rules and shared results. We're talking about a way for companies to collaborate on a vast number of projects. This is just a few of the Linux Foundation projects in action. Linux is only one of these. I mean, we have a huge scope of activities out there. And to get access to any of these projects, all you have to do is turn up and follow the license. That's the gateway. You follow the license, you get this incredible technology, and you get to collaborate with your competitors, with left field companies, everyone making it better. Open source licensing is really about having a fair baseline of access and making sure that third-party intellectual property rights are respected. It's that simple. We all get the same access to the project, and we all know how we'll be respecting each other's IP. When it comes to dealing with complex technologies, the real question we face is, how do we deal with multi-entity compliance? It's never so simple that it's just you making software. It's not even so simple that it's you and, let's say, 3 of your competitors. The supply chains of the modern world are immense. In areas like consumer electronics, even the simplest product often has 20 to 30 companies involved in getting to market. Now, we've decided in terms of the open source community, I guess at this stage, so many people are involved, is to create a simple industry standard for dealing with open source licensing across all organizations in all markets. So we're talking about a high-level way to frame this to make it work for everyone. A bunch of companies, and here's the current platinum member list of the OpenChain project, came together to accomplish this goal. As you can see, it's a really diverse lot. I mean, some of them will be familiar to you, like Hitachi, who build nuclear reactors. And some of them might seem a little left field, like Adobe, who help you edit documents. All of these companies work on open source, deal with it every day. All of these are very experienced companies in open source, and they identified that in a nutshell, they're all doing the same thing. So it makes a lot of sense to align in the approach so we're not duplicating effort. To accomplish this, it was decided to define inflection points where there should exist a process or a policy or training. And to say that at these inflection points, you should have something in place. And the idea was not to dictate having a certain process or a certain training program. That obviously would not scale to multi-size entities across multiple market segments, but to define those inflection points. And our experience shows that once you have something at those inflection points, the vast majority of unintentional IP errors will be prevented. And I think that's important as well, because there are virtually no unintentional IP errors. It's all about making a mistake. And if you put something at these process points, it's highly unlikely that you'll make the standard mistakes of oversight. Someone copy-pasted code, someone forgot to send in build scripts, whatever. Have a process here, the problems dramatically reduce. And if each company in the supply chain has the adoption of a standard with these process inflection points, we suddenly get a supply chain that as a whole dramatically reduces the chance of license compliance risks. And that's what OpenChain is. The idea is that if companies put in place processes at these inflection points, they can show their conformance to this industry standard, and then their customers and their suppliers can identify that company as having the correct processes for a quality open source compliance program in place. Now, defining a series of inflection points is all very well, but most companies do not have a reference library of material to apply to filling out the processes. So the OpenChain project, of course, is building a significant reference library across multiple languages. Again, it's not trying to be prescriptive, but it's very useful when a chip maker gives some reference documentation and an automotive company gives reference documentation. Then all of their adjacent companies can also learn from them. And it ranges from things like merger and acquisition knowledge through to training slides, the whole deal, and it's growing all the time. In practical terms, OpenChain is not an idea. It's a deployed market standard with hundreds and hundreds of companies working on it right now. A whirlwind tour. In Japan, we have a very active community with 7 work groups. The primary group meets every 2 months. The work groups, it's just nonstop. The community in Japan has doubled in size this year. It's about 160 people, about 70 companies at this moment. We've seen the development of communities in areas like Korea. They've held 3 meetings this year so far, kicked off in India this year as well. They just held their first meeting in September. And China held their first formal meeting in September, but we had, I think, 7 or 8 dinner meetings before that. A whole range of the normal companies in each of these jurisdictions involved, and everyone's bringing to the table their knowledge and trying to help their competitors and their customers deal with open source license compliance more effectively. We also have activity in places like Taiwan, where we have a whole range of companies that are experienced in open source, but also a whole range of companies that traditionally didn't really engage with the community. I brought up CJK plus I and Taiwan, so China, Japan, Korea, India, and Taiwan, because these are areas which globally companies had identified as key to having a supply chain that is coherent in licensing. A lot of our base material is sourced from these geographies. Getting the people on board in these spaces helps all of us accomplish our technology goals. Of course, OpenChain has a lot of global activity. For instance, we kicked off an automotive work group focused specifically on that market space in July. We kicked off with 95 people. We now have well over 100 people involved on the mailing list. It's a very diverse group. I mean, just pick your automaker, they're all there. And they're trying to talk about not only how do we do compliance, but how do we frame open source through the lens of supply chain management. So SCM is very typically applied by companies like GM and Toyota and so on. So they're framing open source SCM, and they're putting compliance at the heart of it, so they're working through OpenChain. And it's a really interesting community. They'll be talking about things, as you can see, they've got a 3-year cycle going on right there. And that's just the beginning. One of the automotives told me that they're implementing OpenChain, they're gonna have OpenChain conformance, and it's gonna be with their next series of model cars, so it'll be 2024. So, you know, that's their time scale, that's how they work. We have a reference tooling group, which might be interesting to some of you. A lot of people, they look at things like OpenChain and say it's all very well to identify that you should have, let's say, inbound and outbound checking of code. But how do you do it? I mean, do you have to pay hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars to a commercial provider? Is there any way that you can automate via other options? The answer is, of course, yes. Companies like Siemens, Bosch, Hitachi, Fujitsu, Toshiba are using open source tooling for open source compliance automation today. And they're all getting together to talk about how to explain reference tooling options to people. And right now, they're building out reference tool options that will be suitable for companies in any sector just to download and double-click a container or whatever. This type of activity is very exciting to us. It shows that there's tremendous energy in user companies to get open source compliance right and to try to work out ways to make it easier for everyone else. For those of you taking photos of the slides, I see a lot of photos. Don't worry, Jeffrey's going to share the slides later as well. Okie dokie. The big news really for me with OpenChain and you is that OpenChain is actually on a fast track to ISO standardization. So we'll be an ISO standard in the first half of 2020. I'm hopeful we'll have it in Q1 2020, but it really depends on the past submission process. And that's underway. And the OpenChain ISO standard will be functionally identical to the current version of the OpenChain standard. And of course, it will be available to everyone, everywhere, as always. The real goal in getting into ISO standardization is to answer a request from many of the companies in our ecosystem. They're saying, help me make it easier to explain it to our customers, to explain it to our suppliers, to explain it to procurement. It's a nice, simple thing. And thanks to companies like HP, Microsoft, we're getting through the ISO submission process really quickly. Now, when it comes to things like OpenChain, we're really talking about user companies, but there's plenty of support in the background. For instance, when it comes to vendors, law firms, consultancies, auditors, our partner community has doubled in the last year, and some of the partners are very large scale. So CMS is one of the world's top 10 law firms. Of course, you all probably are very familiar with PricewaterhouseCoopers, and probably a lot of you building reactors, bridges, dams, are familiar with DUV-SUD. All of these entities are part of the OpenChain partner system. As you can see from the map, we're basically covering all major open source active geographies apart from France and Russia. Oh, and for the Canadians, I just counted you like America, so don't worry about it. Now, when it comes to something like a forthcoming ISO standard, you want to make sure that there's third-party certification available. And that kicked off in November 2018 in Japan. TÜV-SÜD launched an OpenChain-based certification for Hitachi at Hitachi's request. But thanks to TÜV-SÜD and PwC, we've got 2 different vendors providing options for third-party audits or third-party certification globally. And I think that's a nice benchmark for us to offer freedom of choice, but also to offer the ability for people to get the certification they might be market familiar with. In essence, we have a standard for open source license compliance, which you can self-certify to. You can have independent compliance assessment from law firms or similar, or you can have third-party certification or third-party audits from the same entities that audit you or certify you right now. The goal of all of this, it ties in with what Denise said. We're raising the boats for the benefit of all. We're trying to get open source compliance right because it's one of the headwinds that slows down adoption and reduces efficiency. Getting open source compliance right means that companies will be operating on a level playing field. We won't have to go through lengthy remediation through the supply chain. And we will have certainty that our IP and your IP is all being dealt with equitably. Now, license compliance, my contention is that it's now a pretty simple problem. You know, it used to be something that was concerning to companies. Open source licenses, how do we follow them? What risk is there? The answer is we have thousands of companies very active in open source. And there are no threat vectors that are providing significant headwinds. It's all about optimization and making sure our resources get the most result. That's what it's really about nowadays. And things like OpenChain show you how to do that. OpenChain, of course, is a community. It's not a preachy group. It's companies just like you getting together to share knowledge and producing outputs like this. This is a document created by Sony and another 12 Japanese companies in Japanese, English, traditional Chinese, and simplified Chinese. And it's a little leaflet just to hand out to suppliers to educate them in the basics of open source, because companies like Sony and Panasonic had identified that there might be individuals who knew open source in certain suppliers, but the company as a whole was relatively weak on it, and the company participants would be saying, can you give us more material so I can explain to my manager? So we do that. I actually gave a whole bunch of these to Luly. God, they were heavy. I brought them from Japan to France to Germany, back to France. It was hard work, so treasure them, okay? and these leaflets are fun because it's something that worked. It's working right now in Taiwan, by way of example, in a very positive way. The leaflet is public domain. It's on GitHub, and we're translating it into more languages right now. In the OpenChain project, that's how it generally works. All of our reference material is public domain. It's all out there. We edit it in the public. We build our specification in the public. We vote on it in the public. And we're just trying to work with as many people as possible to make sure the standard is as easy to adopt as possible. And one really cool thing we have, and it's kind of a side note, I mean, we've got a standard and that's great, but sometimes it's hard to read a standard and work out if you meet it or not. So we made a self-certification questionnaire. It's right there. You go on there, you go yes, no to a series of questions. If everything is yes, then you're OpenChain conformant. You have the key requirements of a quality open source compliance program. If you answer no to anything, you know where to apply resources in improving your compliance program. Tons of people are using this for self-certification to OpenChain, but another cool thing is we found approximately 50% of companies accessing it are doing internal health checks, so they're just optimizing their processes. There's a huge raft of people in the background using this, and it's fascinating to me. I'm going to pull out kind of one of my finale notes. On the health check one, the weirdest one was Philip Morris International. They appeared on the system one day doing a health check. And I just reached out to the guy, the Mele, and I said, you know, it's great that you're part of the community, but why? And he explained that their pivot from traditional cigarettes to IQOS changed Philip Morris International from a B2B into a B2C company. And all of their B2C infrastructure is open source. And also, you know, they're hypothetically thinking about smarter IQOS cigarettes in the future. So they decided to get really good at open source. They decided not to reinvent the wheel. So they went to OpenChain and they were working on the health check. But not only did they do a private health check, then they decided, oh, you know what, there's some extra material we can contribute. And they became an active contributor to our reference library. I bring that up because it's a really good example of how someone from the complete left field can actually benefit from something like OpenChain, but also become part of the community themselves and contribute actively. Our training slides contain information from Philip Morris in Zurich, where they contributed some notes on their own training. It's kind of cool. Everyone's welcome. The only barrier to entry is turning up. You know, you go to our website, you join our calls, you join our mailing lists, that's it. To participate in the OpenChain project in the same way of every Linux Foundation project, there's no gate at all. Our members are Linux Foundation members, but our community is a huge and diverse community, some of which are in LF, some of which are not, all are welcome. I'm going to wrap up here, and unfortunately I am going to the airport. So I will not see you at the coffee break. So I really want to say I am available at any time to talk with you. I'm available to speak with your team by phone or to arrange a meeting. I come back to Europe frequently. I'm very happy to talk through open source compliance, through the OpenChain project, and especially to talk about how specifically your company could adopt something like OpenChain as easily and as quickly as possible. So that's it. Thank you so much indeed. And I do hope to talk to you either through a few questions now or later via email. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
All righty. My pleasure.
So you have Shane's information.
Yes.
Do you have time for a question?
Yeah.
We are running late, so I am aware of that. But
we have a question.
So often open source projects build on other open source projects which may have a different open source license. How do you manage dependencies?
Well, everyone manages it differently, but fundamentally, if there are licensing conflicts with merging code, then it's not necessarily possible to merge the code directly. Sometimes people build out different sections talking through APIs, but it's such a license-dependent question. It's not really an OpenChain question. I mean, we're trying to solve the process approach to compliance. We don't try to deal with license interaction. However, there is a lot of material showing potential license compatibility or incompatibility. And even in the OpenChain project, there are reference materials which show how various law firms, for instance, looked at it. And those aren't intended as canonical guides, but they do show how people made kind of red lines between what they thought worked and what they thought didn't. What I do see in practice is that if companies need to use two pieces of code that are mutually incompatible, they usually go down the route of having an API. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.